Hello and welcome to the SLA Competitive Intelligence Community's presentation, How Not to Present Insights to Decision Makers and Keep Your Job, featuring Nat Brooks. I'm JP Ratajczak, past president of the SLA Competitive Intelligence Community, the leader of Nationwide's Retirement Plan CI team, and your moderator for today. Thank you, Aurora WDC, for sponsoring. They are a proud and long-term sponsor of the SLA community. If you ever want to talk to someone who understands the whole work from home CI experience, they actually started 25 years ago in the back of a beauty salon in Eric Johnson's parents' house. This webinar is just part of the content in the SLA CI community. In addition to our ongoing webinar program, the CIC had a fantastic lineup of presentations at the virtual SLA annual conference. So in case you missed it, conference programming is still open and accessible through November 13th. With all that great content in the books, we want to know more about what you want to see. We're conducting an engagement survey that in just 5 minutes will give you the chance to tell us how we can do better and what topics are important to you and how you'd like to hear from us. We'd love to hear from you, and you'll find that link in the chat pane here momentarily. Along with our survey, we're also looking for your help. The CIC board, which is made up of 17 wonderful volunteers, we have a few positions that are opening for 2021. So if you'd like a chance to be a bigger part of the CI community, or perhaps just don't want to hear me moderating and would like to raise your hand, we'll have some communications coming your way about that soon. A couple of upcoming dates that you want to put on your calendar. The SLA Competitive and Decision Intelligence Certificate Program course, Intel 10, which is Management Analysis, is running now through November 20th. It's being led by the one and only Cynthia Chang Correa, and will help you learn how to understand and anticipate instead of reacting. You'll go beyond reviewing management profiles and learn to understand and anticipate the management actions of your competitors, suppliers, and customers. Lectures for the course are pre-recorded, which gives you more flexibility and convenience to listen to sessions on your schedule. And there will be 2 live meetings focusing on group discussion and questions. For a full course description and to learn more, you can visit sla.org and click the Learn tab. Also, for our final SLA CIC webinar of 2020, we're excited to have SLA board member and former CIC board member Jim Miller with us to discuss continuous learning from a CI lens. Stay tuned to SLA CIC social media channels to find out the date in December and for a link to register. We also want to thank you for taking valuable time out of your day to join the webinar and participate in today's discussion. One lucky attendee will be randomly selected to win $25. So stay tuned, we'll have some more details on that at the end of today. There will also be some live tweeting going on during the webinar, hashtag CIC webinar. So we encourage you to use that hashtag, CIC webinar, to share insights with your network on Twitter and keep the conversation going. Also, you can submit your questions in the Q&A pane here in GoToWebinar. Nat will have some time at the end to address those. So now on to our headliner, Nat Brooks. Nat is principal at Strategy Shapers LLC, where he brings 30 years of Fortune 500 finance strategy and general management experience to the work of helping clients create world-class market and competitive intelligence, as well as develop winning business strategies. His clients have included firms as diverse as Newell Rubbermaid, Johnson & Johnson, Novo Nordisk, Cintas, FM Global, Brown-Forman, Mallinckrodt, Chevron, Mary Kay, Lubrizol, and Pella Window. From 2017 through 2019, Nat was managing partner at Symphony Advisors, a global management consulting consortium, ranked number 347 in the 2019 Inc. 5000. Prior to consulting, Nat led Procter & Gamble's corporate competitive intelligence organization. Nat's a dear friend of mine. We used to lead the SCIP chapter for Cincinnati, Columbus, and Dayton. And I know he has also recently accepted a prestigious appointment from the Ohio governor as a full-time professor for 2 wonderful first graders. So we'll see if any of them make a guest appearance today. With that, I'll hand the mic over to you, Nat. Can't wait to hear what you have to say today.
Thanks, JP. Yeah, I haven't been doing too much work since March, as I'm sure some others have in the consulting business have found their workflow change a great deal. And mine, of course, was added to by becoming a teacher to my young children. Anyway, well, thank you, JP, and thank you guys for joining us today. We're going to talk a little about communication and communication strategy, design, process. This is something that I've done before. We've done this talk with different groups over the years. It's changed a little bit, and it's something that I end up spending a lot of time with clients. As I've worked with clients over the years to develop their competitive intelligence program, it's always nice to build very interesting organization charts and to spend time talking about the big issues that face a company. But it breaks down very quickly if we're not good at getting people's attention and communicating the things that are important. So I've been involved in the good side of this and the bad side of it. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot in my corporate career, and I've continued to learn. And JP and I were talking before the call started, and the thing is, you might call communication a bit of a soft skill, but the good thing is if we become good, crisp communicators of the kind of things that we do in competitive intelligence, it will serve us no matter what we're doing. Whether it's your neighborhood association, whether it's another skill or job that you do in your career, good communication skills travel. And since we communicate or are trying to communicate all the time, it's important to get this right. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit. I want to frame the discussion about communication by trying to turn around the problem a little bit and think about how we communicate from the point of view of our audience, and most importantly, the audience that we're trying to influence, what I call the boss's viewpoint. I guess I had a hard head. It took me a long time to sort of think through this and realize this, and I was lucky enough in my corporate career to report often to senior level executives, and it was only because a few of them sat down and talked to me about their world and the world that they live in, the time frame that they have to operate with, the millions of distractions and things that they're working through, that I begin to respect how they want to be communicated to. So I want to talk about that and then use that to get to some design principles. Now I want to stop for 1 minute and understand, today's discussion is about a good process or a good way to think about improving your communication. It's not the answer. So if you dialed in for the magic bullet, I can't tell you that there's a magic bullet. This is something that we continue to learn throughout our lives and careers. And so I'm going to give you a framework. I'm going to give you some principles and some tips, but we're all going to get better at this together by practicing and working through it. So at the end, I'll share some somewhat dated examples, unfortunately, but some examples of how to think about framing, and I'll show them to you in a couple of kind of classic communications that come from intelligence groups. All right, so why this topic? Well, I mean, here's the bottom line, right? What we do as intelligence analysts or as market analysts in our businesses, strategic analysts, whatever our title may be, it's just too doggone important to hold it hostage to poor communication. And we spend so much effort at the analysis piece. We inundate ourselves as good analysts. We inundate ourselves with information. And then the process of trying to describe what we've learned and what our insight is, if we don't do that well, we're not serving our organizations properly. So with that, let me put this frame in place for you to kind of get started with this discussion, which is what I call the problem of time and focus.
And
not
hey,
your yeah.
Hey, sorry to interrupt you. So while we're thinking about that framework, we don't have any slides up from you yet. So
I'm sorry.
If those are coming, we'd love to see them. Thanks.
Did I not share them? Are they
on? We're going.
Are they there?
They are here now. Yes, thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought we were going through technical difficulties. Well, there you go. As I said, we're all learning. So anyway, I wanted to again let me go back just for a second here, and again, just let the objectives sit up there for a second, but these are what I was starting with. So let me get to this point of framing the problem of what I call time and focus, and not your time, not your focus, but the time and focus of the people you are communicating to, the boss's timetable. So as I was developing competitive intelligence in my corporate life, especially at Procter & Gamble, I had the good fortune to have some executives that took me aside and tried to explain how their world actually operated. And what you begin to appreciate if you try to walk in their shoes for a minute, and I can also say that I've been a little bit on their side of the fence as well, is the sheer volume of commitment and information and different and varied things that come at them is just overwhelming. If you're in the position of a C-suite executive or a large region executive, some organization lead position, your calendar is chock full of meetings, and you're constantly hearing and getting some new piece of information from some new functional area, from some new product trend, from some new group all the time. And it becomes very difficult for people in that position to navigate all the stuff that's coming at them. And so they get very frustrated, and some may have already felt this, and I think I saw a question come in from somebody ahead of time about their boss being frustrated, and because they need to know the bottom line. They need to know, and they don't need to necessarily go through your analysis and your process of learning. They need to know what you've done. And I think sometimes we forget this. We're certainly trained in college, for example, to write in a way where we are showing off how we learned, what we learned, how we got to our analytical position. But in a corporate environment or in an organizational environment that has a lot of pressures and a lot of goals, they don't need to know. They don't need to know that part. They need to know what you learned, and they need to trust that your process works, but they need to know it, the answer, not the process. So with that in mind and understanding that, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that a manager or a boss, how they kind of see things a little bit, and then we'll get into how to design your communication. So some things bosses dislike greatly, and again, this is a little bit corporate focused, but I think any organization that has some goals and something going on and has been moving towards some objective or ambition is going to have a lot of heavily taxed leaders, and so these are some of the things that they simply dislike. But yet they get them all the time. Books of material. We used to talk about how lots of great analysis would be put in a binder and put on the shelf. Well, there's truth in that, and part of it is because there's no way that a heavily taxed and time crunched executive is going to have the ability to go through binders worth of material, so they won't. And then once something is going on, they don't like to be told what they were supposed to read. So again, huge comprehensive material sent to them to show all the little details of how you got to an answer. They don't have time for that, and they don't want it. Interestingly, at least in most of the organizations that I've been in, while PowerPoint is, and I'll talk more about PowerPoint a couple of times in this discussion, but I've rarely come across an executive that wants to sit through a PowerPoint presentation for very long and doesn't particularly like materials given to them as PowerPoint slides, especially ahead of a meeting or during a meeting. And they don't like meetings for the sake of meetings, and large organizations where they have meetings to show off, again, are things that executives simply don't have time for. Now, here are some of the things that executives really like. They like to have material presented in a decision-making format. So they like documents that say, here's what you need to know, or here's what you ought to do, or here's an opinion or a recommendation. What they don't want necessarily is, again, all that work that led to it. The one-page memo or 1 or 2 page documents are ideal in the fast-paced environment that they're living in. And again, they don't necessarily need the book. If there's material that needs to be digested, say some market research or a satisfaction survey or some other testing material that you feel like the executive needs to have in order to move a decision, that's fine to give it to them, but you don't have to give them everything. You need to give them the critical summary parts of that and your confidence levels and things like that. What you don't need to do is give them the absolute primary research materials. So again, and then giving them time, especially if it's an important decision. If PowerPoint is used, and of course it's an important meeting facilitative tool, it doesn't need to be comprehensive and full of words, and you don't need to sit there and read it to them. The other thing too is to understand, and we'll talk about this a couple of times, is to make sure that material that you are communicating, sending to decision makers can be accessed. And that's another issue with some of the sort of the Microsoft or Google suite of tools. If it doesn't show up on a device, a phone, it's hard for them necessarily to stop and process it. And that's changed a substantial amount in the last 10 years. But executives are on the go all the time. They're being inundated, and so you want to provide them with material that they can access wherever they are in this 24/7 world that we live in. All right, a couple other things in there. Again, when you meet with executives, and I will say that the gold standard is face-to-face. When you can meet with them, keep it to the point. Don't bring in people. Don't have show trials. And again, something to keep in your mind too. It's always tense to go into a situation where you need to present and you've put together some script or some process to explain what it is that you're asking somebody to do or to take note of. But really think about it this way. The real thing is to have them asking questions and discussing and thinking about and playing with the ideas or the insights that you present. So if anything, what you want to do is make sure that when you have meetings, that you try to drive the meeting to discussion, and you try to drive the meeting to them asking questions and talking about the data, rather than simply droning on. So keep that in mind as a process, because that's how they will learn, especially given the significant pile of information that's constantly bombarding them. When they can talk it out, when they can restate the point, when they can get into a Q&A format with the information or the insights, that's when you'll learn and they learn, and that's when we can make better decisions. All right, so, and I'll clean this up. I mean, I know all of us are smarter than our bosses, and we often look at our bosses and think of them as poorly informed or not good decision makers. But if we stop and again think about it this way. It's really about respect their time and the fact that they're under a lot of pressure and they're being bombarded with lots of stuff. We're aiming for productivity. What we want to have, whether we dislike, like, we don't respect, whatever it is you think about your leaders, make the goal value-added interactions and try to look at it from the standpoint of what you want to do is not inundate them, but you want to try to enable them to see the insight and have it shine through. So that's what we're trying to get at. So that's sort of a background on how to think about framing. Now let's talk a little bit about actually building your communication process. As I said before, this is a learning process. It's not, there's no silver bullet. But there are some things that you need to think about. So one is to start with obviously with your goals. And I'm going to say this again throughout the discussion, and I'll say this again probably in Q&A, but Whenever we try to build something in intelligence, in any business function, I believe, is to try to think about the punchline first and work backwards. So let's talk a little bit about the goals of intelligence, your job. I always thought of it this way, and as I did this over my corporate career and have done with clients, I still think these are the sort of the prevalent things. And so when you think about these goals, about what your intelligence objectives are, then the design should flow from them. So one, obviously, is to give the unfiltered, objective, real view of what's going on in the market and with your rivals in that marketplace, whatever that is. And in order to do that, one of the unspoken jobs that you need to do, and it's important from a communication standpoint, is you need to set the tone of language about how you talk as an organization about your markets and your rivals, or the other key players, stakeholders, whatever language you want to use. And I call it the competitive lingua franca, which means everybody needs to start talking about rivals, markets, the way you do. So when you design and think about your communication, you want to build a language around your market, around your players, and you're the one who needs to own that language. So maybe it's the way you talk about a particular company, maybe it's a nickname you give to them, maybe it's a reference point to critical trends in your market. But those things, you need to create those, and you need to bang away at those. So that here's the success in that. When you go into a meeting months down the road, they play back to you your language about the marketplace, your language about your rivals. Obviously, timely insights, trying to tie insights to decision making. And your overall objective is, if you do these things well, is you want to develop this sort of line of sight. You want to be able to be in what I call the drive-by position, where the boss comes and pokes their head in your door, asks your opinion. And the more you do that, and the more trust that you develop in doing it well, then you gain this right to bypass the chain of command. And so the two images on the slide, I mean, I think drive it home, right? You want to have that red phone relationship. You want to be the person they call. And you're not going to be the boss, but the picture from The Godfather, you want to be the consigliere. And that's the role that you want to build. So with those objectives, let's talk a little bit about design. Some principles first. One, the KISS principle is so important in this, is to try to keep these things as easy and simple as you can. So my first principle is economy. Less is almost always more. Make it easy. Again, is it app friendly? Is it simple? Is it straightforward? Importantly, and this is true in almost all corporate functions or corporate activities, business activities, but it's particularly true inside, I think, the competitive arena, is turn your communication on its head. Make sure you put the critical insights, recommended actions, put those at the top. Again, go from the punchline backwards. So when you do a project and you start thinking about designing a communication about something, whether it's a white paper, whether it's an alert, whatever it's a newsletter, is think about what it is you want them, the one sentence that you want them to walk away with, the one insight, the one decision that they need to make, and go start there and then go and build the case from there. Another thing about communication, and this is true mostly in the written communication, but is to write with the exit ramp strategy. And what that is again, economic, keep it short, but always at the end of each section of a communication, allow it so the majority of readers can feel like they're informed and they can leave. Now, some people will go all the way in. Some people will dig all the way into the details. Some people will ask for more information, and that's fine. But for the majority of the people that you're going to be communicating to, they want the critical thing, and they want to be able to leave after they've learned it. don't make them wait. And again, face-to-face is better than almost any other kind of communication. Hard in this COVID world, but the whites of your eyes, the whites of the eyes communication is still critical. So thank you, Zoom, but that's the way we got to do things. So people need to see what you're saying, and they need to know who you are. All right, so some things about design, and at this point, JP, I think we said we'd do a little survey, but I think of sort of 4 elements that make for a really good intelligence communication process. So I don't know, can we turn that on, JP?
Yeah, we'll get the first poll started here.
So the poll is essentially to ask you all whether you are doing these 4 things. So the first one is basically to design some specific communication tools or templates or approaches and brand them. You know, whether we like it or not, in a role where we have to compete with so much other information that is going to our bosses, you know, we got to do a little marketing. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to go out and get professional help to do it, but you need to come up with some kind of way of distinguishing the things that you do, especially the regular things. So say it's an earnings report on a competitor, or it's a trade show report or something like that. There needs to be some specific approach and structure, and the more regular it is and the more impactful it is, and if you can get a brand name to it, then it's remembered. Second thing is, well, you know, people will go back and forth about newsletters, and I've been both a fan in my career and sometimes not a fan in my career. You should have at least some kind of regular communication strategy, what my term is drumbeat. You don't want a situation where they don't hear from you for extended periods of time, because then you can't establish that competitive lingua franca that we need to have in the organization. So regular reporting of some kind, fashion, or form needs to happen.
So now,
the third
can you see the?
Sorry.
I was going to say, can you see the results there of that first poll?
I think I can, but let me finish the points and I'll look at it here. Okay. The third one is making sure that you design that drumbeat to the best of your ability inside the planning calendar of your organization. So if your organization has a forecast process or a budget setting process or an investment schedule or whatever the thing is that drives the planning of the organization, plug your analysis in so that it happens, what I call, at the point of decision. So you want to build that way. And then the last thing that we've already said is the app friendly piece. So let me see if I can see the poll results.
So we'll do these one by one. We've got the first poll here about curating a branded set of deliverables. 59% said yes, 42% said no. People could choose either. Gotta love polls these days, right? Let's go ahead and move to the second one. We'll get that one.
Okay.
That one is, do your reporting efforts have a regular cadence or drum beat? Yes or no? We'll just leave this open for a few seconds here. We'll keep moving through these.
So the first one you said,
I think we had 59% that said yes.
Okay, so 60-40. Okay, good. That's good.
Now the second one that we've got here about the regular cadence or drum beat, 53% say yes, 47% say no.
Okay.
And do your reporting efforts have same one here.
So the tied to the planning company or the firm's planning process.
Yeah. So we've got that one up here now. We'll see how people vote on that here. And this one, perhaps the most lopsided of the ones we've seen before, looks like we're trending at about 90% say no. No
Wow.
process around point of decision. About 90 to 10 about.
Okay.
Then we'll close that one. Go to our last one.
And how does the last one turn?
Are your reporting efforts mobile friendly? Well, how do you think these will come out, Matt? What do you think?
Well, one would think by today, after so long with our devices in the device-laden world that we live in, I would think that would be heavily yes, but it won't surprise me one way or the other.
Okay. Well, although the majority of people are saying yes, about 54%,
okay,
45% are saying no. They're not mobile friendly.
Well, let's talk about mobile friendliness. Actually, let's talk about PowerPoint for a minute. Are the slides still up?
They're up now. Yep.
All right. So just a word about PowerPoint and all this again, and I know I beat this to a little bit to death, but PowerPoint is a useful and wonderful tool, but it has some real drawbacks. And the biggest one is it's linear. So trying to build, and I live in the consulting world now where the client deck is the fundamental deliverable oftentimes. So I'm as guilty as the next person at overdoing and overusing PowerPoint. However, understand the PowerPoint limitations. One, it insulates you from doing the most important thing, which is creating the in-person communication and getting the words in people's heads. Because slides are linear and they're hard to portray the dynamic, multivariate kinds of things that are going on in your markets, it's just hard to get some of that stuff across in the way that you can in personal communication or in narrative communication, such as a memo. So be careful. Don't let PowerPoint become a crutch. Because it is linear too, oftentimes it hides poor thinking because it doesn't allow you to explore logic across different elements in an analysis. So be careful with the PowerPoint thing. All right, let me move on here. So let's get a little bit more into actual pictures of how we write and how we do things. So again, as I said earlier, economy in everything is so important. You have a very limited amount of headspace that you're going to, or headspace you're going to have from your executives at any particular time. So you can't deliver voluminous stuff. You have to deliver stuff that's crisp and to the point and helps them move on and make decisions. So your principles in writing are really these, I think, and again, they're pretty straightforward, but especially those of us who have maybe just gotten out of higher education, these things are a bit opposite of what you learn in that environment. First off, write in the active voice. Make sure that you don't use difficult verb forms or long-winded sentences. Be quick, be simple, keep it active voice. Be expository in the sense of don't start sentences with all sorts of interesting clauses or characterizations. Don't say, in my humble opinion, or things like that. Instead, just expose the data. We analyzed X. We found Y. We believe this. The data points to that. To the best of our ability, we think this. So keep it in a way that is about the information and about the insight. As I've already said, put the insights and the conclusions up front. If you're writing to recommend an action, say exactly that. This recommends that we take action to do this or to do that, and then build the case behind it. So in the classic one-page memo format, which if you have not done, and if you want to spend more time on after the call, I'll be glad to spend time with you or your organization on. But is the classic one-page approach is to simply put the clear piece in the initial summary or conclusion paragraph at the beginning. So that is what it is that you're talking about. And again, there'll be different kinds. So sometimes it is to communicate information. It's not to make a recommendation. But more often than not, it's to suggest an insight or an action step. Use the facts, and I like to do it in numbered or bulleted points that confer the logic of the argument. Make that the discussion, and then clearly list out at the end what happens after the document is read or the meeting has been held. These are the three things that should be in most business communication. And certainly, again, you can make it available and say, if you'd like to see more, or you'd like to look at the data in more detail, or you'd like to discuss, we'd be glad to spend time answering questions. But the most of the communication needs to be in this very simple format. And again, because it's intelligence, make sure the critical implications and that competitive lingua franca is first and foremost. So if you have an insight about something, the market is turning in a certain direction, or consumers are doing something different, or our rivals are behaving a certain way, and you need to get that point across, it's got to be in that summary conclusion paragraph. All right, so with that, let me give some examples, and then we'll go into some questions. How about that? All right, so let me give you an example here. This is a cleansed up long ago version of an earnings report. So again, it's a simple thing. This will be the heart of most drum beats. Will be let's say a product introduction, or a new marketing move, or an earnings report, or any of those kinds of documents. Again, one page. And going back to the principles, short, sweet paragraphs at the beginning that explain what happened and allow the recipient to stop if they wish. So the critical headline, what has happened? So in this case, the company being looked at, the critical point is steady progress fixing each business. So they know that. That's what they need to know about it. They don't need to know all the details. If the reader doesn't care about all the rest of it, they can stop because they learned the critical point. The highlights. So here's the classic thing in an earnings analysis or an acquisition or trade show report or anything is there's lots and lots of information to be shared. The best way to organize it, I've found, and I've certainly run into this with more than a few clients, is to try to put things in short bullet points. So rather than try to narrate the whole thing, put the critical points. And when it comes to numbers, especially numbers, put it in a table, put it in a chart. Don't sit there and write a narrative about the information that's being conveyed, the numerical data. I cannot tell you the number of times I've gone in with organizations and had this in my past of people trying to write the narration about things like market share or earnings data or what have you, and you get these ridiculously stilted sentences like growth was -3%. You mean they didn't grow, they lost? Okay, wait a minute. But rather than try to write those narrations, just put it in a table. Put the data out there. You got smart people; they can learn how to read them. And if it's consistent and looks the same each time you do it, then it's much easier for them to follow. All right, so this is the classic alert. I would say you can do the same thing with newsletters. Again, make it short and sweet. Don't be exhaustive with the data. The highlight, the insight, the key point is what you want people to see. Now, the sort of set piece of the intelligence game, as all of you I'm sure know, is the big report, the white paper, the analysis of some particular topic. Maybe it's an investment thesis. Maybe it's a market trend analysis. Any kind of white paper, the bread and butter of what we do oftentimes. But the same general rules should apply here as well. There are a couple things that might be different, but for the most part, it's the same idea, the same concept. Short, declarative, factual sentences. Again, structure these things such that the reader does not have to go all the way to the end. If there's a conclusion or an insight, if they're up front, that's what you want to do. The other thing is, and I think there were some questions about this too, about data and tables. Yes, put pictures that tell the story. So that doesn't mean any kind of picture. That doesn't mean a sloppy chart. That means a chart that tries to express the fundamental insight. And that's where you should spend a lot of time, by the way, is to try to figure out and design the right killer chart that allows the reader to really visualize the insight and let it do the talking. Let the table, let the chart, let the graph do a lot of the storytelling. And certainly if people ask, I mean, if it does that piece and it gets people interested, then you can always follow up with more information or spend time on the phone explaining. But let that chart do the talking. Now, another thing too about visualizations is when you create visualizations, again, make the visualization do the work. There's a chart in here that shows a red, yellow, green kind of thing about specific elements of, I think this is about private label in the consumer goods game. In some of those, it's green. It doesn't need words, so don't put them in. Let the color of the chart, let the design of the chart or the graphic do the talking. Don't get extraneous and don't try to shove too much stuff in. And I guess the final point is now in a white paper, oftentimes you'll have recommendations or indicated things, but they're not urgent. You can put them at the end. That's fine, because some of those are further to-do steps, or we'll revisit this in a year, or whatever the deal is. That's fine. But again, going back to the prior example, the urgent stuff should have all that at the beginning. So with that, maybe we have some questions out there. JP, you want to?
Yeah, we have lots of questions for you, Nat. So hope you're ready. And a reminder, if you have them, send them in the Q&A in a pane and go to webinar, and we'll get those answered. So first off, thank you, Nat. That was great. All the experience that you've learned over the years sharing with us is very much appreciated. We've got some blocks of questions around different topics, so I'll try and group these as best I can. First one, how is, or does writing differ from industry to industry when we're talking about intelligence?
Yes, it does. And it depends a lot about the nature of the industry, and it may depend too about where you sit in an organization. So for example, I sat in the finance organization in Procter & Gamble. Well, they want a little bit different picture. They really are about the underlying financial results of rivals. And you know, they were characterized by a belief that financial understanding is what drove businesses to make decisions. And that's not all wrong, but it's not the whole picture. So for example, if you're in an R&D function in a highly technical industry, then it's going to be a different again, because then it'll be much more about information around technical factors about maybe a competitor's product or approach. There might be things about toxicology. There might be, it could be anything, but a lot of it depends on where you sit. Now, if you go into an organization like that as a generalist, you need to learn some of that. But the fundamental of being economical and structured in the way you write, that works everywhere, or should work everywhere. And so oftentimes, if you do this really well, what you do is you teach everybody else how to be better at it, so that then the pace of decision making, the pace of knowledge transfer can increase in the organization. You teach people how to do that, because you learn to put the insight and the thought-provoking piece or the decision-making element in the front, that should work just about anywhere. But yeah, it does vary greatly from industry. I mean, when you're having done work in the pharmaceutical arena, right? Very different. Timetables are different. If you're in a service industry, let's say the service industry has to do with gas stations or uniforms or something like that, right? That's a much more fast-paced. The language is rougher. It's a bit more, it really is. It's a bit more brutal because it's like your success is being driven by whether or not you get that account tomorrow and whether you can increase your number of deliveries next week. And that's completely different than what you might find in the oil industry, where things move at a glacial pace. So it's just yeah, it's going to be different. But the technique here of putting your communication strategy together should work just about anywhere.
Gotcha. And maybe to follow up on that question, and your answer might be that it depends on industry, but what do you do in terms of getting the information out? Do you try and get it out in a very fast pace and just as soon as they happen, or save things up and perhaps deliver 3 or 4 stories at a time? I mean, how do you have a balance of that? You just got to feel it out, or what is it?
I think you have to learn your way into that. Again, industries are moving at different paces, right? So pharmaceuticals is much slower and more deliberate. Distributorships for cleaning supplies move much faster. Something else, they move at different paces in different places. So you have to learn. The other thing is you have to decide too about how. So, as part of developing that language of competition and getting decisions to react and move at the right pace, you may want to play a role and try to think about your communication in terms of setting that pace. So what I mean by that is, if decisions aren't being made or being pushed off, try to understand a little bit of that, and then see if you have a role of, maybe by increasing the cadence of communication, maybe you drive a decision making faster. Mm-hmm. Other cases, maybe you're in an organization which seems like it's a hip shooting operation and it reacts to everything, and its strategic pathway or purpose is not real well set, and a lot of wasted time is going on. So maybe in that case you want to pull back a little bit and maybe say, well, the reason I didn't do that is because, so what? They bake bread every Wednesday. I don't need to tell you every time they bake bread. They do it every Wednesday. So you need to think about it. And the amount of analysis you need to do of your own organization, where you fit in it and what the organization is trying to accomplish, is so critical, because you want to design against that. That's why I put that point in there too about the designing to the planning calendar. When do decisions actually get made? And sometimes you want to force them out of that process and get them to a new decision-making cycle. Sometimes you want to pull back and say, no, let's not waste a lot of energy in the organization. Student body right, student body left. Let's maybe try to tamp down some of that enthusiasm, because there's a longer decision cycle needs to be in place.
Okay. Were you surprised by those results that 90% are not tied to any kind of calendar?
I'm not, and here's why. And it's something that I've probably talked about in forums and in talks before, is that there's a market research sort of heavy element to a lot of intelligence organizations. And depending on where you sit in an organization, if you sit tight in with marketing, or you sit tight in with finance or something like that, or you have a direct C-suite kind of thing, you're going to be more tied into that. If you're not, if you're a little bit further away from the center of the operation and you have this market research sort of mentality of, we collect a lot of primary information, we get a lot of secondary, then we do primary, and we build up a big analysis, you don't want to be held to that. You right. want to be held to that timeline. And when I go in and help organizations sort of evaluate where they are, I'm more often than not, I'm like, you got to stop that. because your existence as an organization and the tremendous work that you can bring and insight you can bring, you're asking to be punted to the curb if you're not inside the slipstream of the decision maker. So if you got to get into you got to get onto their calendar rather than try to think that you're going to bring them over to yours, because you're not. I'll say it straight up. You're not going to bring them to you. You want to go to them. That doesn't mean you have to do everything that way, but I mean, you need to move as much as you can into their process and cycle.
Right. So here's another one that came in. Well, let's say you do get into that cycle, into that slipstream. If you present a strong argument to an executive that includes a decision recommendation and the executive does not take action, whose fault is it?
Well, ultimately, the buck stops with them, but it's your fault too, right? I mean, I think if you make a good argument and they don't take it, now you could be wrong too, but that's the risk you have to take. I mean, the ambition to be good at what you do and have your organization be successful, then you need to share it, I think. Now, obviously, if you make a recommendation and they don't follow it, I mean, that, unless it's existential in nature, you're not going to get canned. But you need to be thinking about that risk. I mean, if you want your organization to be successful and you have an insight and you've done the work, then take ownership. I mean, go to the mat.
Yep. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded, so it will be shared later, so everyone will have access to that. Couple other questions here.
Yep.
How do you account for insights you know that they want, but that are simply not available? And how much do you explain why something is not included? Like the omission of information.
The omission of information. Well, if it's not available, it's not available.
How much time do you spend saying that and addressing questions perhaps preemptively?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can frame it in terms of, we surmise that a certain thing is true, but we have no basis for that. And I think it's important to expose those things, actually. How many of our organizations operate on folklore or assumptions about the world that are probably not true? Or they sound good and they've got a kitchen logic to them, well, everybody loves this, so they'll buy it, kind of thing. If those things aren't true, then you should lean into them. And again, if you can't get the information or it's going to be too expensive to get the information, then I think you need to be upfront about that. But it shouldn't be. I want to be careful with this, but you shouldn't be in a situation where you say, well, they won't pay for us to get the information, therefore, the hell with it. That's not what I mean. You owe it to your organization and to your decision makers to frame the problem. If they choose not to help you with it, that's fine. But don't take your toys and go home. Do the best you can with the information that you can get to them. And if it's an unknown or an unknowable, you need to put it out there.
Makes sense. All right. Here's another. What's your opinion of a storytelling model? Situation, task, action, result, to persuade someone to take a specific action versus the classic one-page memo?
We all tell stories. It's a natural. The narrative form is a human thing. That's why the person-to-person communication is so important. So the way I look at it is the one-page memo, the frame, the chart, the picture that you present is one piece of it. The other piece is, if you've done that well, then you get the right to come in and talk more about it, and then you will go into storytelling mode. It's nice to think that we're going to operate in a just the facts, ma'am kind of frame, but you're not. And the more you do it, and part of this process of creating the competitive language in your organization is a storytelling, right? Yeah. So if a particular rival does something all the time the same way, or particular executives act in a certain way, that's a story, because not everybody operates perfectly logically. Not everybody, nobody does, right? Nobody operates perfectly on the data and the logic. There are behaviors, there are other issues, right, that are driving behavior. I mean, it amazes me in this day and age, but I mean, there are companies that will do things, for example, based on some public appeal or something from a public relations standpoint that makes absolutely no sense to their markets or for their customers, but they'll do it. So for whatever reason, right? There are executives that have enormous blind spots and they will do ridiculous things. I forget whose line this is, but it's like executives will repeat their successes until they become failures. So they're one-trick ponies. That's not completely true. There are very smart people that learn and get better, but I think that's something. Those are stories that have to be told. Now, as good competitive analysts, we also need to frame them according to the level of assumption or folklore that is driving that story. And then it's up to us to go try to validate those stories with information. But you got to tell stories. I mean, that's how you'll win people to your argument. But do the memo right, put the information correct, get the right frame that gets you the right to go tell the story or to tell the counterfactual. Well, if we don't do this, this might happen, for example.
Okay. Right. A little bit of a clarifying question. Can you elaborate more on lingua franca? Franca, is that something you made up? Is that a vocabulary?
No, I think that's a lingua franca comes from international affairs, I believe, right? So there was a time when French was the language of diplomacy. So not in our lifetimes, but there was a time, right, where if you went to an international conference, everybody spoke French. So lingua franca was that was the language of international affairs. So my point in is simply to use that term as there needs to be a language that you help set in your organizations of how to think about, how to understand your rivals, your markets, the trends that are driving your industry, whatever the elements are. You want to be the one that sort of drives that understanding, because that understanding is very important to setting the way people think about their problems in their industries and how they solve them. So if the language is, well, company B is always the second one into the market, or company D does this, or executive so-and-so always says this, or whatever those things are, that framing and you constantly either validating it or banging away on it is what gets into people's minds. So then they start to understand, oh, if we do that, if we make that market move, they will react. If we make this market move, they won't, because it's true to their form. Well, the whole discussion about what is their form is the language or the lingua franca that you need to establish in your organizations. Because oftentimes, if there's not a good intelligence function or market research function, executives are flying blind. They're making it up. It sounds good, so that's what we're going to do, and that's often great. But then they get into it after a while, and the competition decides, okay, or somebody else comes into the market because we're making money. Well, when that happens, people need a process to think about it, and you need the process of talking about it, validating it, moving it, getting that into their heads, because we're not really data driven, despite what we all like to believe. Humans are not that data driven, but data can influence the way they think. You create the story, and then you start to insert the data to move that story. No one else is doing that in your organization. Well, some are, but they're doing it without the kind of analytical process and rigor that you bring.
Well, one more question, and this is more for our delivery of materials, not the written form. And I think this is applicable to not just intelligence right now, but in a time where everyone is an elevated anxiety level. Before you go into meeting with an executive or delivering your insights, what's one tip that you would give to help calm yourself down, to prepare, to make sure that you're presenting it as well as you can?
What do you want them to know? What do you want them to say? What do you want them to do? Start there. Keep that in mind. And it's perfectly okay. I've learned this after thinking that I needed to do all the preamble. But then, as I got in more influential positions, I learned that all I need to do is go in and sit in the chair and say, I'm here to ask you to do this, or I'm here to tell you about this, or I think we need to understand this, or here's our appraisal of what happened. Get to the point. One, we all have this performance anxiety thing where we think we're going to go into a discussion and they're going to judge us on how well we give a speech. No, they want that insight. You're there not to show off. You're there to give them information to help move the process along. Don't convince yourself that that's not what you're there for. Don't convince yourself that you're there to perform. That may happen, right? That happens, right? Because you're always being evaluated for your performance, right? That's true. But the performance is the insight, right? The performance is the information, the insight, the criticality. That's the thing, right? So, you can have ice cream on your head, doesn't matter. If the insight is the thing that makes the organization go, oh, hadn't thought about that. Maybe we should do that. I'm really glad you brought that to me. Well, if you have a stain on your shirt when you went into it, no one's going to remember the stain on your shirt. They're going to remember what the insight was. That's number one, is to keep the end in mind. Always put the punchline before the joke.
That is great, and worth the extra couple minutes to talk through that and all these other questions. Nat, can't say thank you enough for, again, sharing all of your insights, all of your experience with us today. As a reminder, for all of you in the audience, one lucky attendee will be randomly selected to win $25, so you'll receive an email from us if that's you. There's also going to be a link again to the CIC engagement survey in the chat pane. We'd love to have your feedback. There it is. Thanks, Liz. Also want you to just stay in touch. So whatever feedback you have, please send it through that. Otherwise, there will be another SLA CIC webinar featuring Jim Miller in December. So stay tuned for that, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Nat, again. We'll see you all next time. All right, take care.